Hi everyone, and welcome once again to these informal chats that I'm having with people who are making an extraordinary contribution to the lives of non-human animals right across Australia and indeed around the world. We've been having these series of podcasts over a number of months now, and we've had some incredible people, and none more incredible than the guest that we've got on today. Today we have Dr Jacquie Rand, an Emeritus Professor of Companion Animal Health at the University of Queensland and Executive Director and Chief Scientist for the Australian Pet Welfare Foundation. Now, the Australian Pet Welfare Foundation is the peak research body and advocate for pet welfare in Australia. As a not-for-profit organisation, it specialises in evidence-based solutions for reducing euthanasia in animal welfare shelters and local government facilities. Professor Rand has an outstanding research career in veterinary science spanning 45 years. He is recognised as an international leader in two research fields, companion animal health and shelter medicine, and has authored over 115 journal articles, 118 abstracts, and 42 book chapters. As the editor of 3 books. I know, you're all thinking the same thing as me right now. What a chronic underachiever, hey? She's worked extensively in shelter research, including collaborative studies over 14 years with the RSPCA, the Animal Welfare League, and local governments. While at UQ, Professor Rand taught urban animal management and since 2013 has co-authored 21 peer-reviewed articles on the management of urban domestic animals, including 7 related to semi-owned and unowned cats. She's also author of government reports and discussion papers on the management of urban dogs and cats and consults with local governments on urban cat management. Now, outside of all of that, Professor Rand is the lead researcher for the Australian Community Cat Program. And the aims and concepts of this project are now novel and innovative in the Australian context. The project is a collaboration for the first time in Australia between academic researchers, national veterinary care organisations, animal welfare organisations and local governments to implement a large-scale community cat program for urban stray cats based on desex, adopt, return principles. Specifically, that research project aims to investigate whether a contemporary community cat program based on desexing for semi-owned, unowned and owned cats in targeted urban areas reduces free roaming cat numbers and the problems they cause, to include risk of disease transmission to humans, pets and loss of wildlife. Welcome, Jacquie. And that's an extraordinary CV.
Makes me sound very old, doesn't it?
Thanks, not at all, not at all. It's just an extraordinary body of work and congratulations.
Thanks, Andy.
No problem. Look, to begin with, would you mind sharing with our listeners the role the Australian Pet Welfare Foundation has in some of the current initiatives of the foundation and why these initiatives play such a critical role in the emotional and physical well-being of companion animals?
Yeah. So, Andy, the Australian Pet Welfare Foundation is dedicated to improving the health and welfare of companion animals to benefit pets and people. And we do that, as you mentioned, by creating new knowledge through research. And we share that knowledge with the community, with shelters and pounds, state and local governments and veterinarians to create change which saves lives. And I think we all appreciate the huge advances we've had in medical health and the improvements to treatments and diagnosis for humans through research. And equally, we can bring those advances to companion animals, and particularly the area of shelter research was in its infancy 10, 15 years ago when we really didn't understand the problem. So, essentially, it's about increasing our knowledge of what the problem is, because you have to understand the problem to be able to create solutions. And that really is what research is. It's about asking, what is the problem and how can we do it better? And it was clear that when I was teaching urban animal management and I was teaching students that being homeless or for a dog or a cat killed more of them. And this was to fifth year veterinary students that had just spent 4.5 years learning about how to treat and diagnose disease. And it was pretty confrontational for them to be told that there was something else that was killing more dogs and cats than any disease they'd just learned about. And most of the animals that died were young and healthy. And so I asked a question, what can we do about it? And clearly we needed to understand where the problem is. And that's where the whole journey started.
And this seems to be a problem, I think personally, from a governmental level, across all levels of government, doesn't matter whether it's local government, state or federal, regardless of what policy setting you're looking at, there seems to be these days very much a mindset of, well, let's just treat the symptom rather than going back root and branch and reviewing what the cause is and dealing with the cause, because it seems that dealing with a symptom has become a rather popular way of dealing with immediate problems, and then waving your hand on one side and showing, look at this shiny thing over here, I've fixed the problem, when in fact the problem is actually over here and you've done nothing about it, which is where your research really comes into it, and that first question that you've said that you put through these students, that why aren't we looking at the root cause of a problem? Let's examine and get back to basics here and find out how we can fix a problem completely so that it's not a problem later down the track.
Yeah, and absolutely. And Andy, when we started to ask that problem, and when we looked at what was being killed in shelters and pounds, far more cats were being killed, although similar numbers of dogs and cats were entering shelters. But when you look at the number that were reclaimed by the original owner, it's about 4% across Australia, compared to sort of like 60-70% of dogs. And also the percentage of those that are left after the ones that have been reclaimed by owners that could be then rehomed, only about half as many cats were being, at this time, rehomed as dogs. So for example, Victoria, when we just reported the local government data from, in 2018, we reported it, and we showed that 8% of dogs on average were euthanized of all those that came in, but 48% of cats. So pretty terrific, terrible statistics. And a quarter of Victorian councils, either through their own pound or from the shelter that they have a contract to manage the animals, a quarter of those killed 67 to 98% of cats. So there's a problem.
Yeah, and do you think part of that problem might be that cats are actually suffering from an image problem in Australia with Australians, in that they are very often blamed for an enormous amount of wildlife loss. For instance, when, like as we were saying before, the root cause of the problem is that people are not dealing with the issue that needs to be dealt with at the start to take care of that.
And you're right, we've certainly demonised cats in Australia, but the issue of the number that are being killed, you have to understand. So we then ask the question, well, where are they coming from? And in fact, when you look at what's coming into councils, into local governments, between 80 and 100% of them are all stray cats. And they're coming from the suburbs that are most disadvantaged. They're low socioeconomic suburbs. And when we're talking about some of these suburbs, 20 to 30% of the population could be classed as low income, which is 2.4 people living on less than $650 a week. So how the heck do you, if a cat, and cats are opportunists, if people can't afford to have their cats desexed, so there's free kittens around, cats will find a better opportunity, they'll find someone to feed them. And these people have compassion, they care for them, but they can't afford $350 to $500 to have the cat desexed. And so in these most disadvantaged suburbs, many of the owned cats are not desexed, whereas we know across Australia, in our cities and towns, it's about 90% are desexed. But if you go to the low socioeconomic areas, it drops very much. But these people care for the cats, and when they help, and particularly down in the city of Banyule. They've shown it works very well. And we're now, I've got a program up here where you go in and you offer these people an opportunity to have their cat desexed. And we're offering it free, and so is the city of Banyule. They're so grateful. They're so grateful. They don't want the cat to keep having kittens, and those kittens, find their own way out in the community, or they're given away as, free to give good home to someone else who can afford to have them desexed. But if you come with a non-judgmental eye, and you look at what is the solution to the problem, Banyule have decreased their impoundments from 8 cats per 1,000 residents, which is a little bit, the average for Victorian councils is 7, down to 1.2 cats by just offering targeted free desexing. And it's cost effective. The Jenny Cottrell, who is a fantastic animal management officer in the city of Banyule, she's estimated they've spent $60,000, the council, on free desexing, and it's saved just under $400,000 in impoundment costs through their third-party provider.
I've had an accountant refer to this scenario as the theory of reducing economic responsibility. And I think it's a very good way of describing it. If you look at it, say, from a state government perspective, an initial investment of what might be a couple of $1 million in the first year would then, by nature and best completely over the next following years, the amount required automatically reduces because of the numbers of animals that require that service are being reduced as you go along. And therefore the burden on the taxpayer becomes less and less organically. And I think it's a wonderful way of describing that theory, because in practice it's applied in many other situations, in terms of when we look at economic assistance for businesses, and big business particularly when something is a new enterprise getting off the ground. The amount of government grants that are available for that sort of thing are huge. And then it's part of the contract that they sign with a particular government that reduces over time as that business becomes more self-reliant. So it's a flip side to that, it just makes perfect sense.
Absolutely, Andy. And not only that, if councils just want to kill them, then they have to pay all the trapping costs. But when they implement life-saving strategies, then the community will help and animal welfare agencies will help. And so, for example, in Banyule, the Cat Protection Society has given them a certain number of, I think it's something like 200 free desexings. So welfare agencies don't want to take all these cats. And so it reduces the cost to local government as well by implementing strategies that are in line with community expectations these days about humane management of animals.
Exactly. And Jackie, as many of the people watching today would know, last week I tabled the largest e-petition in the history of the Victorian Parliament, over 27,000 signatures calling on the government to end hound convenience killing and to allow rescue groups to save more animals. And once again, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who took the time to sign that petition. And you've all played such an important role towards achieving critical reform. And Jackie, the work that you do also plays such a critical role in the steps towards reducing and ending convenience killing. Can you perhaps share your experience of convenience killing as a vet and that of a companion animal advocate on the front line?
Yes, I can, Andy. And they're still raw. Some of them, I had 2 experiences 40 and 30 years ago. 40 years ago, I was a young locum down on the Mornington Peninsula, and that veterinarian had a contract with the local council to go down once a week and kill all the dogs that weren't reclaimed by owners. And back in those days, 40 years ago, there wasn't the same programs to help find new homes for dogs, to help them with some mild behaviour issues or escaping issues. And so I was going down there and I was killing young, healthy dogs. And it was awful. It was just awful. And I didn't, I wasn't there I was only there for a couple of weeks, but it left such a mark on me that there had to be a better way to do things. And then after I came back from working overseas, I was in a shelter, and this was about 30 years ago, and the whole room was lined with cages with cats and kittens in them, and they all had to be killed. And as the staff went around the room, you're euthanizing these cats, the kittens, they don't lie quietly in your hand. You have to inject the barbiturate into their hearts or their abdomens. And it's awful. They mew, they squirm, they try to get away, and it just devastates people. And it's still raw, and I wasn't doing the killing. And it's just awful. And a shelter veterinarian fairly recently said to me, I've seen so many people's lives damaged by having to kill a never-ending stream of kittens and cats. And we know Australian research shows that people directly involved with killing end up with post-traumatic stress. And it's not just people killing. Jenny Cottrell talks about sitting in the car with a pre-weaned kitten, a 3-week-old kitten, couldn't find anyone to take it, knowing that shelter was overwhelmed and they had a policy of killing all pre-weaned kittens. And she just sat in the car and cried because they knew as soon as they took it in, it would be killed, and it was. They couldn't find anyone to take it. So it just has an awful, awful impact on people. It's not protecting wildlife. It's costing local governments money.
I agreed. The toll of the mental and emotional toll on people cannot be underestimated. We see it with wildlife rescuers all the time after years and years of seeing just such senseless death and fighting for that life. And I guess that's what comes down to it. To be on the front line there and to be holding a being in your hand who really comes down to that one final moment where all they want in life is just to live for their own sake, just to live. Worry about everything else later, but just to be able to live. And I think that's the focal point of every living being, whether we're human or non-human, is that what at the end of the day we want to live. And I think a great more could be achieved on a philosophical point of view is if a lot of people could transfer that basic desire of their own for themselves and their children and their families, etc., over to non-human animals, then they might understand. If they can transfer that understanding across to those animals, then I think we'd be in a far better position, and initiatives like you advocate for would be far easier to achieve, and society would be better as a whole. So now that we've solved the problems of the world, we can move on to another question, if you like, and that's that you mentioned earlier that one of the main initiatives of the Australian Pet Welfare Foundation is the Community Cat Project. And can you just explain to our viewers the role that initiative and Desexing Cats plays in ending the killing of so many companion animals? If you can just go into that a little bit more in depth, that'd be wonderful.
Yes. So, Andy, the Community Cat Program is based on demonstrating that desexing cats is an effective way at reducing cat impoundments and cats coming into shelters, is very effective at reducing euthanasia, but also all the other issues, the number of free roaming cats, the complaints that come to councils, the cost to councils, the risk of disease spread like toxoplasmosis. But the issue is that it's not legal across Australia to desex a stray cat and leave it living in its home location, in its outdoor home. That's illegal in every state, and it varies with state by state. Queensland's the most restrictive, and you're not allowed to feed a stray cat, you're not allowed to move it, you're not allowed to rehome it. In Victoria, the legislation that doesn't allow the cat to be there is partly under it's considered abandonment. and cats have to be kept on your property in Victoria. So there's issues there. But, you know, we've tried for years to manage them. Animal management officers respond to complaints. They provide a trap cage for the resident, or they trap it themselves. And we've been killing, on average across Australia, we estimate it's 50% of cats that enter in shelters and pounds. It's at least 80,000 cats every year that are being killed. Most of them are young and healthy. And so I've spent 15 years researching this problem. And the first thing is to ask, where are they coming from? Well, some are owned, but many are semi-owned cats. And these are cats that are fed by people who don't perceive they own them. They talk to the cats daily. They say the cat helps them through the tough times, but most are not desexed because they can't afford it. And they're the major source of cats and kittens coming into shelters and pounds. Banning feeding doesn't work. You just can't ban compassion. These people keep feeding. And they're very traumatised when their cats are trapped and killed. The other major source of cats and kittens are cats that people own who simply can't afford to have them desexed. And again, it's in these most disadvantaged areas. So mandating desexing doesn't work because it doesn't address the main barrier, which is cost. And, just let me emphasise that we published data from 191,000 cats coming into RSPCAs across Australia, and it shows that mandatory desexing is not effective. And it just criminalises cat ownership for low-income people, and it encourages these semi-owners to say, well, it's not my cat. Mm. Whereas what we're finding is that about at least 70% of these people who are feeding a cat because it wandered in, they felt compassion for it, they wanted to help it. Once you can offer them free desexing for that cat and microchipping and free registration, most of them are happy to be an owner of the cat. They want to do the right thing, but it's just too difficult for them cost-wise. And the other barrier, Andy, which is a real problem, is the no pet clauses in rental agreements. Now, I know Victoria has got legislation. I think it was delayed the implementation till next year.
Correct.
And that will make a difference.
Mm-hmm.
But, if you're in a rental accommodation and you're not allowed a pet, well, you can't take ownership of one of these cats.
No.
And the data, what's coming out of COVID is the appreciation of how beneficial pets are to our mental health. And so it's a social justice issue. You can't ban tenants with children, but you can ban tenants with pets. And it's going to be interesting to see how it rolls out in Victoria, whether there's still, people with pets still are at the bottom of the list in getting rental accommodation.
Yeah, you're right. It'll be very interesting to see the take-up because at the end of the day, real estate agents are still in charge in that rental area, and whether they choose to discriminate or not will be very interesting to see. And who brings the first landmark case, I suppose, that they missed out on a rental simply because they had a companion animal that had to be considered. I just want to also touch on something you talked about there of like coming out of COVID. I think the attachment and the emotional thanks that people will have for these animals will be far greater when we're out the other side, because I think they will recognise that these animals might have been the one thing that got them through by having to be able to be having this animal here that they could talk to, they could confide in. Pardon me. I think that will give a greater sense of attachment and a greater emotional attachment to those animals coming out the other side. So it makes far greater sense in that context to be able to provide the financial support for desexing.
Absolutely.
So that those animals don't roam, so that they don't just come into these people's lives and then leave again to whatever fate might befall them.
Yeah. And, just to give you an idea of the size of the problem, so in a typical city in, say, Melbourne, would be about, sort of 100 to 200,000 people in a city of. And so in a city of 200,000 people, there's at least 10,000 cats being fed every day by people who don't perceive they own them. And so, and typically animal management officers would impound, based on the average for Victoria, 1,400 of those 10,000 cats, but it leaves at least 4,000 females producing an average of 5 kittens a year. So that's 20,000 kittens. Unfortunately, most of, about 75% of them die before they're 6 months of age, which is a welfare issue, but enough survive to ensure you've got the same number or more next year. So it's a total waste of money trapping and impounding those cats, and then they have to pay for them to be managed to try and find a home for them or euthanize them. And, if you don't believe me, look at the New South Wales pound data, and we looked at it over 7 years, and they impounded 173,000 cats. They killed 107,000 of them. Didn't make any difference to their intake. It was 24,000 at the start of the 7 years, and it was 24,000 at the end of it. Yeah. And yet, how many people's lives were damaged? Half of those were kittens by killing 107,000 cats. And science tells us that, and that's actually low-level killing, and it won't protect wildlife. It just damages people and it costs money. But science does tell us by doing things differently, we can get a different outcome. So if you go back to that city of 200,000 that's got 10,000 semi-owned cats, we could reduce that to 5,000 or less in 5 years. And we have 2 choices to do it. Modelling shows that intensive killing would be effective, but no city's ever done this because we have to trap 30 to 50% of the population every 6 months for at least 10 years. So why hasn't it been done? So in that city of 200,000, that's more than 6,000 cats to kill in the first year alone at a cost of $1.5 to $3 million. So it's just too expensive for local government, and it's simply not acceptable in this day and age to our communities. But we can achieve the same result as intensive killing does by intensively desexing cats for less financial and social cost. And we've published pilot data from 2 Australian studies, which is consistent with the overseas research, that you can get a 30% reduction in free roaming cat numbers in 2 years and a 50% reduction in 5 years. So targeted desexing programs are the only feasible method of reducing the numbers of free roaming cats in our cities and the problems they create. And so desexing programs will protect our precious biodiversity. They will markedly reduce cat-related complaints for local governments, and they'll help to reduce the spread of disease like toxoplasmosis, and they'll help to reduce the terrible toll on people who are working in shelters and pounds.
I think that's absolutely amazing, and it's very sobering to hear the numbers put in such very plain terms, so that it just makes perfect sense. And for those who are wondering if there's a term for that, there is, and that's trap, neuter, and return. And that's, I know that you're a strong advocate of that, clearly, and as are a number of people who members of our party are as well. And it's often difficult for us to make the argument, but I think if everyone listening can refer back to those numbers that you've just quoted, I don't think anyone can stand up any argument against that. It just, there's nothing like raw data, if you like, to slap down an argument, and to prove that something is correct. Look, we have gone well over time, and that's fantastic, because I don't ever like to hold any one of our guests back, because every issue that is brought onto this program is extremely important, not just for the lives of the animals that we talk about, but for the human animals as well. And Jackie, if you could leave our listeners today with just one thought, what would it be?
Well, Andy, clearly legislation needs to change in Australia to allow desexing of stray cats. Funding is urgently needed for the research to show community cat programs work. And we need to stop pretending that killing cats in our cities and towns protects wildlife. It doesn't. It damages people's lives and it costs local governments money. And just as a final, community cat programs are much broader than trap, neuter and return. They're about helping owners who can't afford to have their cats desexed. They're about helping those semi-owners become owners and increase the what we call responsible cat caring behaviours. And then there's a smaller component which are truly unowned, and they need trap, neuter and return, because it's stupid to spend money on the other areas when these cats that are unowned continue to produce kittens and repopulate the areas. And a community cat program also has a lot of community education too about how to keep your cat in at night in a low-cost way for like strategic feeding. So it's not just trap, neuter and return, which tends to have a lot of opposition. It's really a contemporary cat management program which helps to save lives, both animals and people's lives. So thank you, Andy.
Oh, no, thank you, Jackie. Thanks for your time today and all the incredible work that you do. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Andy, for the opportunity to talk with you and your listeners.
Cheers.